This episode I'm joined by Simon Sellars. He's a writer, editor and custodian of Ballardian.com. This episode we're going to be discussing the work of J.G. Ballard and Simon's new book, Applied Ballardianism, Memoir from a Parallel Universe. Enjoy. So the first question is the Hermitix question. If you could pick 5 thinkers, living or dead, and put them into a room, which 5 would it be?
The 5 thinkers I would put in a room would be, first of all, the 3 presiding deities of my book, which are Ballard, of course, then Virilio, then Baudrillard. You know, they're prophets of the apocalypse, they're techno-pessimists, they share an interest in speed and velocity. I think also I would like to have Philip K. Dick in that room because, after all, my book is a book about, in part, conspiracy theory and the madness that comes from trying to make connections between things that can't be connected or aren't naturally connected and falling down the rabbit hole in that sense. I think Philip K. Dick would be interesting to have in that room because he's the ultimate paranoid conspiracist, really. And then finally I would have David Cronenberg, who has a true knack of almost an uncanny ability to take multiple threads and make them seem coherent in this one vision that's true to himself. So, for example, Cronenberg has done a straight adaptation of a Ballard book, Crash. He's done a film which is virtually a homage to Baudrillard, Videodrome. And he's done a film which is virtually a homage to Philip K. Dick, which is Existence. But what he's done is he's brought those all together and made them into one seamless Cronenbergian vision. And in a sense, that's what my book is trying to do. It's bringing all these disparate threads that people weave together and bringing them together into a homogeneous vision that may or may not be real.
That's a great room. It's just like you say, a homogeneous, paranoid, very strange. I'm not sure if I could figure out who would actually almost take command of that conversation. I imagine Ballard would probably.
Ballard, when he was on the rare occasion was asked about French theory, always, except for Baudrillard, who I believe he had respect for, almost denied knowledge of these theorists. So I think he would be a sort of, maybe in a sense, an amused bystander. But yeah, I think it would be very interesting. I think it would be paranoia as a transcendental means to embrace the world, perhaps.
So is there a question or a way that you'd like their discussion to go in? Something that you perhaps would... An area you'd perhaps like them to venture into, or a question which has kind of always pestered you?
Well, I think what happens in my book, if I can speak through the lens of my narrator, is that he struggles to interpret the Ballardian view or internalizes it too much. And what he does is bring in these other theorists as a way to pick that apart. But what it does is send him further and further into the rabbit hole, and he, much like the characters in Cronenberg's film Existence, goes into various layers of reality until he can no longer find his way home. So I think, in a sense, he sort of abandons the Ballardian vision, because I think the Ballardian vision, or the vision presented in a lot of Ballard's work, is a way of, and Virilio to that extent as well, is a way of accelerating the apocalypse so that something can emerge at the other side. I think for Philip K. Dick and for Cronenberg, it's more a matter of getting lost in that process as well. So, again, speaking through the lens of my narrator, I don't think there's any way to shape that narrative. I think that it can either be one of 2 scenarios. It can end in the apocalypse, or it can end in complete schizophrenia and paranoia. I think you just have to let them fight it out and see which way it goes.
So if you're taking the decision to step into that room, you're accepting complete loss of control. Just accept what comes of this. I like that.
It's possible, or the other possibility is they just may not have very much to say to each other at all and may see no commonalities. In that sense, we'd all pack up and go home.
Yeah, and then it would become a very, very paranoid, kind of nervous room of people wondering why they've even been put there. Especially, I imagine Philip K. Dick would probably be on edge, kind of wondering what the hell's happening. So as we're talking about Ballard, I have to ask you how you initially came across his work and began an interest in his work.
I first encountered Ballard much the same way as the narrator of my book did, who, I must say, is almost a part of myself, so I will continue to talk through the lens of the narrator. It was an edition of ID magazine from about 1987, but I didn't read it in 1987. I read it about 7 or 8 years later, just before I started at university. And it was a very strange and unsettling interview with Ballard in which I didn't know vaguely of Baudrillard at that point and the concept of hyperreality, but what Ballard was talking about was very similar to the Baudrillardian notion of hyperreality, and it immediately got my attention. And he was talking, and you have to remember this is 1987, pre-internet, and he was talking about in the future, people will start projecting themselves on new mobile private networks. He said they'll start broadcasting their own lives to the world. And I was immediately struck by this because I was reading the interview at the start of cyberculture, maybe at the middle of the golden age of cyberculture, and the internet was just starting to take off and so on. And it immediately struck me that Ballard was almost prophesying this moment in time that I was living through almost a decade before. And when I looked into more of his backstory, I realised he was making those predictions as far back as 1977. It sounds cliche to say that this is what YouTube, for example, is now, but you go back and read those interviews and it's extremely similar to how the birth of YouTube and the popularity of YouTube had played out. So at the time, I was really struck by this, and he was talking about television as a cyborg extension of the mind's eye as well. And so he was talking about these everyday furniture of life, the everyday technologies that surround us, but couching it in this very, very weird, very unsettling cyborg techno-body interface, but doing it in this very calm fashion. I mean, I think people always characterise Ballard as dystopian, but he was almost saying these sorts of things in this very playful fashion, almost like it was an evolution that we had no choice but to take part in. This is almost imperceptible merging of our bodies with technology. It struck me as this extreme vision, but also really just spot on with what was going on around us. And like I said, the birth of the internet, the popularity of cyberculture, the talk of virtual reality and how we're going to upload our minds into computers, all of that stuff was going on in magazines like 21C, Mondo 2000 and so on. But here was this figure who I vaguely knew from my childhood as a science fiction writer, now seen to be the father of cyberpunk, for example. So all of that was a very heady sort of mind explosion for the young would-be student that I was at the time. So from there, I started reading Crash, and most people know Crash as this extreme work of techno-fetishism, I guess. But once I sort of got over the initial shock of reading Crash, I realised that what he was saying in Crash was exactly like what he was saying in that interview, that these banal technological exoskeletons that we embrace are imperceptibly moving us towards a sort of primitive singularity, if you like, a sort of post-humanism where we're merging with these objects, with these technological objects, without even realising it, just through the sheer fact of their ubiquity and our dependence on them. And that's how I got into it, really. And as the narrator describes in the book, it was a life-changing moment. As I said, a lot of people see Crash as this very disturbing and extreme work, and certainly I can still be quite shocked at it. I still pick it up and read it from time to time. But I also found this level of excitement in it as well, where I was thrilled to read something that was so radically upturning the world as I knew it.
Okay. So you found you saw Ballard as and the narrator sees Ballard as the person who brought to the fore the thing that already was this layer, this very perceptible layer which we all see and know and interact with, but he makes that extremely apparent as to how strange and real the I guess you'd call it the lens of kind of techno perception of living through TVs, living through cars, living through technology in general. This big thing on top of everything which is there but isn't always seen as it kind of almost should be, because it's not generally it's just accepted in a passive way. So do you think the narrative suddenly Ballard makes this thing which is quite passive, it's suddenly an active force for him now?
I think that's true. I think when the narrator encounters Crash, the book, and has that moment of his head exploding after reading it, what it does is, this is the start of his pursuit of a sort of mirror world, or the parallel reality of the book's subtitle. Because what he gets fixated on is the ambivalence of Crash. And I think ambivalence is a really key feature of Ballard, and one of his writing's most powerful aspects, where as I said, I had this thrilling response to Crash. It thrilled me on a very visceral level, almost a sexual level, a fetishistic level, but at the same time I could recognise the extreme violence of the thing. And I think the trick that Ballard pulls off, or not a trick so much, the mirror he shines on the world, is to show us that ambivalence where we're simultaneously enthralled and destroyed by a technological environment. So Crash shows us this image of car culture as sexy, as seductive, but at the same time it's this destroying force. And to go back to Virilio and Baudrillard, as I said earlier, the narrator starts to make these connections between these three, what he would describe as these three deities, and all of them speak of this sort of technological ambivalence. Baudrillard actually wrote an infamous essay on Crash where he asked the question of the novel. He said, is it good or bad? And he said, we can't say. It is simply fascinating. And then he says, that's the miracle of Crash. Virilio also talks about the accident being the underside of any technological invention. So in Virilio's, to paraphrase Virilio, when we invent the ship, we also invent the shipwreck at the same time. When we invent the car, we invent the car crash, and so on and so on. So for all three of them, the extreme thrill, the pleasure, the desire to be derived from these technological moments are inextricably linked with the fascination or the sort of death drive to the other side as well. And I think that's what I found and what my narrator found so seductive. But I guess the narrator, where he comes undone, is he cannot pull himself away from the sort of dark underside of that equation. He keeps talking about a concept of Ballard's, about where Ballard talks about inner space, the concept of inner space going into a sort of imaginative mind space, and Ballard talks about in inner space, it's a sort of dream logic where black becomes white or white becomes black, and opposites embody the characteristics of their immediate opposites. So in the case of the seduction of car culture, it's the underside of the car crash. And so the narrator can't pull himself away from that equation. He keeps going to the dark side in a sense. So where Virilio and Baudrillard talk about that sort of that tension and that balance between the two extremes, the narrator can't sort of apply the brakes. And that's where he spirals.
Okay. So so Applied Ballardianism, your book, was that, if we're to flicker between, as you've mentioned the narrator is in some part you, so if we're to flicker between the two, as clearly the narrator as its own person, but also clearly an articulation of your own kind of journey into Ballardianism, is the book meant as an exploration into that world, that Ballardian other world?
It is. I think the concept of inner space, that alternative mind space that Ballard talks about as a sort of reaction to systems of control or reactions to the crowding out of our imagination by external forces, I think that is kind of a driving theme of the book. So yeah, it is an exploration of that. But the elements of myself that come into there are, in some ways the book is what it claims to be. It's a memoir from a parallel universe. So it's kind of me at the time that I was trying to do my PhD on Ballard, reading too much Ballard, overanalyzing the apocalyptic and dystopian elements, and imagining myself essentially living a Ballardian life. There's a quote of Ballard's where he talks about, people often thought that Empire of the Sun, which is his novel based on his childhood in Shanghai, was his autobiography, purely for the fact that it was based on Ballard's wartime years in Shanghai, when Shanghai was occupied by the Japanese and the Ballard family were interned in the Lunghua civilian war camp. But Ballard always said that Crash was his true autobiography. Ballard never in reality crashed cars for fun or tried to maim people or sexually fetishized cars, but he said Crash was an autobiographical novel because it was about his inner life and his imaginative life. And he said it's absolutely true to that interior life, not the life that he actually lived. And he was going through a lot of turmoil after the sudden death of his wife from pneumonia in the 60s. And this sort of came out in this really extreme material. The Atrocity exhibition, for example, was written in the wake of that loss of his wife, and various other dark stories that he'd written. It all culminated in Crash. So I was always really struck by that quote of Ballard's. How could this extreme novel be his true autobiography? And reading more about how he said it was true to his imagination, it really struck me that that's the way I had to write the book as well. There's a whole backstory about how my book came to be. Mark Fisher originally commissioned it for Zero Books in 2009. It was meant to be a sort of straight translation of my PhD thesis on Ballard into a sort of quasi-academic text. But at the time, I was going through a lot of struggles in academia. I'd just graduated with my PhD. I was struggling to find work. Cultural studies, the sort of discipline I'd been trained in, was dead. There were no jobs for people like me, especially with someone with such a niche research interest as J.G. Ballard. So I was going through all of that, and I was having a lot of dark apocalyptic thoughts and simply read too much Ballard. So, but on top of that, there were the struggles with academia, the struggles to make a living, the struggles to sort of find myself. So I didn't do it deliberately, but I realised what I'd done later is I'd internalised that quote of Ballard, and I'd tried to write an autobiographical novel that was true to my imagination. And because I've read a lot of science fiction in my life, I've read a lot of apocalyptic science fiction, my imagination naturally turned to that. I guess the other thing that I was going through was after I'd done my PhD, I tried to turn my academic research interests into social media and the impact of social media and so on, the psychological impacts of social media. But Ballard would always bubble to the surface, and I couldn't help thinking about some more quotes of his where he said that there's a quote of his to paraphrase where he says that the only way to treat the external world is to treat it as a complete fiction. And conversely, the only true reality is the inside of our heads. And I couldn't help thinking how this was really appropriate in a time of so-called fake news, a time where we can project the most perfect image of ourselves through augmented reality, through social media and so on. But also about how attention spans are supposedly getting shorter, all of this stuff that people see as the negative byproducts of the age. It all seemed to speak to this concept of Ballard's about how all of these fake realities are swirling around and crowding out the ability to think clearly and to have clarity of thought, and how the only way to go forward with that is to create your own reality inside the imaginative mind space of inner space. So all of that percolated into this novel, which has become my memoir from a parallel universe.
That's very well articulated. So, a memoir of an inner life which you kind of mistakenly fell into as a means to almost mask your struggles in something more exciting than probably the banal reality that they were. Do you miss that inner space at all? Is there any part of that memoir where you kind of think that world would be in some way useful or enjoyable again, or is it entirely in the past now?
There are times when I felt that I wanted to push that mindset or that way of life as far as I could. So there are moments in the novel, there are moments of violence that the narrator encounters, which are sort of based on incidents that happened to me. When I was going through all of that, I don't think I was a particularly well person, in the sense that I was going through a lot of sort of internal struggles trying to make sense of all of this stuff. I seem to attract a lot of negative attention of the kind that the narrator attracts in the book. And it was kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And yeah, I seemed to be a chaos magnet at the time, and all of that was feeding into it as well. So I never thought it was a sustainable philosophy. I felt that if I kept living that way, I might not live very long. The way I described it to someone recently, someone asked me in another interview if they thought applied Ballardianism, that is the theoretical framework that this narrator dreams up, whether that can be a framework for interpreting the world. And I said no one should ever look to that for a conceptual tool unless they're tired of living. The point is that applied Ballardianism almost kills my narrator, and that really is the point of the book. Is it's a very unhealthy way to interpret the world. And it's also about the dangers of obsession. There's various levels of obsession going through the book. So it's the narrator's obsession with Ballard, mixed in with the narrator's obsession with his girlfriend who's left him, and that's a sort of, these two themes are sort of weaving in and out of the book. It's the obsession with the loss of his academic career and how to get that back on track. But I also see it as a book about chasing ghosts. So whether it's the ghost of his lost love or the ghost of Ballard, who could be his true love, in fact. It's all about chasing those ghosts and in so doing, manifesting a sort of ghosts in front of him. There's a lot of occult and paranormal stuff that goes on through there as well. And again, that refers to what I was saying earlier about the sort of conspiratorial, paranoid mindset of the narrator, where he's having this internal struggle that he has to create this own reality inside his head. And essentially, I guess that's what conspiracy theorists do, is they interpret the world in a way to make sense to their diseased mind or their troubled mind or whatever. And again, that's the flip side of Ballard that I always keep coming back to, is there's a quote that the narrator talks about in the book, which really means something to him and guides him through this, is the Ballard quote, where Ballard says, "Deep assignments run through all our lives. There are no coincidences." Now, in one sense, that's a sort of, that's Ballard's way of saying that we can interpret the world however we want. We can take this set of reality materials and create a new reality as a sort of survival mechanism to crowd out all the other fake realities. But on the other hand, it could be read as this sort of ringing endorsement of conspiracy theory. And that's the sort of equation that the narrator can't escape, that sort of cycle of thinking. So in a sense, it's about all of those things. It's about trying to make connections where there are no connections. It's about chasing ghosts. It's about being obsessive and overthinking and all of that. And it's also about, it's about not quite having the tools. Well, the narrator always sees himself as a failed academic. He doesn't feel he has the theoretical tools to really become a true academic or a true philosopher or whatever. So he kind of invents his own. And, and really the book is about spinning out the consequences of that way of thinking. So on the one hand, as Ballard sort of describes it, it can be this sort of survival mechanism. On the other hand, it can be, a real path to self-destruction.
The interesting thing, I think, that you're your book brings, and it's in the title, because one can have Ballardianism, but of course your book brings this idea of application. But what you previously just said there about kind of entering Ballard's world, and how you or your narrator utilised his view as a way to see the world to the point of like self apocalypse almost. Do you think that it's actually even possible to read Ballard without any hint of application? I'm not sure one could read him at complete arm's length.
You're saying you're not sure, so you're saying that you would have to internalise some aspects of it?
I think you couldn't read any of his works really without in some way it alters your inner world, your mind, your view of the world. And so I think perhaps the dangerous part is just how far you take that as truth.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people hate Ballard. He's still, to some extent, a cult author, despite the success of Empire of the Sun. I think people can tend to be obsessive about Ballard. I've been writing, reading, studying, participating in discussions about Ballard for a long time, and I've seen some protectionism going on of viewpoints that people think that Ballard is about, or an interpretation of Ballard. And I guess, in a sense, the book is about that as well. It's about what is it about Ballard that inspires this sort of behaviour in people. And like I said, I've been guilty of it myself, of thinking I've got this one true key to unlock what Ballard's about. But then I've seen other people do that as well, and their interpretation of Ballard is completely different. It's like they're reading a completely different author. And that's another really, I think it goes back to the ambivalence in Ballard, that he's always holding these contradictory sets of opinions, and it spins out into all these multiple forking paths. And in a way, the book is about working through that as well. It's about saying, well, what is it about the mechanism of Ballard's writing that inspires that? Why do people want to own it? Why do people want it to colonise them? Why are people so protective of their viewpoint of what Ballard is about? I can't really think of another writer who inspires so many wildly different interpretations. I mean, it even goes down to the level of politics. I've seen right-wing writers say that Ballard is a tool of the left. I've read Ballard himself claiming admiration for Margaret Thatcher, but then on the other point, holding these really humanitarian, almost left-leaning views. The man is a massive contradiction. He was born in Shanghai, but he's supposed to be English. What is he? Is he a science fiction writer, or is he not? He always said he started off as a science fiction writer, then he rejected science fiction because the world was becoming science fictional. So I think a central crux of the book is trying to explore that equation. To go back to your question, I think, most people who really get into Ballard do sort of invest a part of themselves in that, or a part of Ballard becomes invested in them. And it's really interesting. Maybe you can't sort of read him without having that reaction.
Yeah, it's interesting though you say about what is Ballard, because there's an interview, or what is he himself, because he's born in Shanghai and then moved to England. But there's an interview where he says about people visiting him in England and expecting something along the lines of the things he writes about. So kind of, I guess you'd say like an acidic, cyberpunk, crazy, drug-fueled cyberpunk kind of mess is what they were expecting. But they found a middle-class, very quiet, in a rural location, just this middle-class, quiet family. That's what I was going to say. You were saying about how people often have an averse reaction, often hostile reaction to Ballard's writing, which in relation to what you've said about this idea of the inner life, and Ballard sitting down as this middle-class, quiet Englishman, but when he goes to sit down, he says in this interview that he was often appalled and and struck by the fact he could even write these strange and horrible books. So perhaps that people's hostile reaction is in the fact that, alongside bringing to the fore the strange technological reality, he's also bringing right to the front of people's minds their ability to even address such horrible possibilities in life.
To me, it really sums up the essence of Ballard. I mean, why should someone who writes what he writes be a drug-addled cyberpunk maniac? I mean, it makes no sense. If you're talking about, if you go back to the conception of Ballardian inner space as a space where you can truly be yourself and live out your wildest fantasies, it would make sense that you would have this banal surface reality sitting on top of that. I may have lost the thread of your question, though.
People, you mentioned that people have a hostile reaction often to. Do you think that's because Ballard's writing is bringing, and maybe this is something your book does as well, is it's bringing to the front of the reader's mind their own possibility to also think in that way, in that kind of often asocial or straight in just their own way to think in that strange means.
It's possible. I mean, I'm hesitant to nail down what exactly makes Ballard tick, because I've just spent 400 pages in the book not really coming to a conclusion. All I can suggest is that the prescience that I described earlier it derives from Ballard's, I think, deep understanding of the psychological forces that shape us through this sort of merger with technology. And he brings home some uncomfortable truths about that. So all of that stuff I mentioned earlier, where he talks about television being a cyborg extension of the mind's eye. And there's a story of his also called The Intensive Care Unit, which talks about similar themes. And it's about a near-future society where people never meet in the flesh. Everyone communicates behind a private TV screen, and everyone has a private video camera that they video their day-to-day interactions with and beam it to their loved ones, to their family. And what happens at the end of that story is the narrator gets bored with this lifestyle and he decides to bring his family together in the flesh. And for the first time ever in their existence, they're not behind their screens, and they're not interacting through screens. And they suffer this kind of reality overload and start hacking each other to death with household scissors. And this book really struck me as an evocation of the way that, without descending into cliche here, but the way that people these days, myself included, are welded to our screens in the form of smartphones, our computers. I'm talking to you through Skype. I've never met you. I only really knew your real name until recently. We speak to each other through these avatars. Everything is mediated. And, you read news stories about how people get disconnected from their smartphones and they go crazy. They have psychotic episodes. They can't deal with it. Their concentration suffers, all of this sort of stuff. Ballard, writing that story in 1977, I think that he had this uncanny knack of projecting near future trends that were rooted in the psychology of how we interact with technology. And I think that's what's really powerful. So he's not actually predicting the nature of technology itself, which is where a lot of science fiction predictions go wrong, or they become outdated or whatever. What he's doing is looking at what surrounds us on a day-to-day basis and bringing to light some really uncomfortable truths about the way we're outsourcing our bodies to technology, or outsourcing our memories or our minds or whatever, and in the process saying, what does that do to our sense of self or our sense of being? And I think that's what kind of provokes extreme reactions in readers. It's like it's surfacing this deeply uncomfortable truth. That's certainly the way I've experienced Ballard.
It's interesting there as well. You mentioned the intensive care unit where they're all speaking through screens, which is actually the exact purpose and I guess you'd call it plot of this reality, need to emphasize that, TV show which is going on at the moment called The Circle, which they literally all interact through screens. So whether or not that will end in them scissoring and stabbing themselves to death on mainstream TV, we'll have to see. But this isn't in any way connected to that as a segue, because otherwise this is going to seem strange. But there's an underlying plot in your book which actually in some way it does connect with that idea of real life connection, and all of a sudden having real life connection when you're stuck within that kind of inner life is often something that's ignored. And there's you've mentioned this to me before as something that's been overlooked, or perhaps almost I see it as kind of smothered by the reality that's going on in the narrator's mind as opposed to the actual reality. And it's the fact that within your book there's a love story going on. I wondered if you could kind of comment on what or who or in what sense is this underlying love story, this strange woman who keeps appearing. What is she to the narrator? What is there a meaning there that's meant to happen in relation to the Ballardian inner life, or is it a simple case of a romantic love story?
Well, part of me wants to say the book is at heart a love story. It's a love story with Ballard, I guess, falling out of love with Ballard or becoming too obsessed with Ballard. But there's also, as you say, there's that sub-narrative of this woman who keeps appearing. Now, if you read enough Ballard stories, there's always a mysterious woman, a cipher, who comes in and out of the story. An enigmatic figure. You know, I can try and place an interpretation on what that means in Ballard based on his biography and so on, but I think that's kind of banal and a bit crass to do that. But what I will say about my book is that the story of lost love in the book, in the form of that woman, is about it. You know, it's about obsession, and it's again going back to obsession and about chasing ghosts. So the narrator has lost this woman, or the woman has left him because of his bizarre inward-looking behaviour. She's just simply had enough. She's too smart for him and she can't deal with him. He's a child. He can only see things through the lens of science fiction films. She thinks he'll never grow up and he's just dragging her down. So she leaves him. But he remains obsessed by her because of what she represents when he met her at the time of his life, the way he saw himself, the way he saw himself setting himself up in a relationship, all of that sort of stuff. And I think that anyone who's been through deep, possessive, addictive love and has then fallen out of that can kind of relate to that sort of idea of being obsessed by this ghostly image of your former partner, your former lover or whatever. I also think of the film La Jetée, the Chris Marker short film, and the image of the woman in that, and how she keeps reoccurring in that tortured man's life history. He's never really sure if he's remembering her or if he's time travelling to the past and actually meeting up with her, or if he's just imagining this woman. And to me, taking that idea of lost love and weaving it into all of the other inner turmoil that the narrator is going through, so his mind being crowded out by new realities, new augmented realities, projections through social media, and then he's got this ghostly image of the woman. It becomes a kind of metaphor for trying to grasp onto something in the face of all of that, for trying to grasp onto something that was real. I guess in much the same way that the woman functions in La Jetée. It's, the man is in a sort of a post-apocalyptic Paris in La Jetée, and the woman reminds him of a time before the war, and it was something tangible and something he could grasp onto and hold onto inside his mind as he was going through all of this torment. And so I've kind of used it in that way. But, that's a bit over-intellectualizing it. It really is a story of lost love. However, there's a third element to it as well, and I can't really talk about it without giving the end of the book away. So there's this sort of other kind of science fictional layer on top of that as well. Yeah, so it kind of functions on many different ways, but it's interesting to me because, I've done a few interviews about the book and there's been quite a few reviews of the book, but no one has really mentioned the function of the woman. And I really did deliberately set her up as that sort of Ballardian cipher and also that sort of Markerian, as in Chris Marker cipher as well. She even shares the name of the wife in Crash, by the way, and no one has picked up on that. So it's good that you've raised that because it opens up a number of key issues in the book and the way you see the book.
This is a very, as you're bringing up key issues, this is perhaps a question too bland and almost strict to ask of your book, but is there a key issue you wish to address by writing down your journey? Was that almost a kind of SOS letter to other people who may be going down that rabbit hole? Is this like a warning almost from a parallel universe as well? What are the other issues that you wish to address with the book?
I guess another sort of key motivation was going back to the difficulties I had finishing my PhD. In many ways, I felt that I was researching something of great importance, and I still believe that the prophecies Ballard unleashed on the world are like really, they're really important in the way that our technological society has developed. And I think that, he's on a par with people like McLuhan as a sort of forecaster of the way technology will transform us or evolve us or whatever, or devolve us. And so at the time I was thinking this was really important research, but I was having, like I said earlier, I was having trouble finding an academic job. Treating a novelist as a philosopher was not something that was ever going to win you any kudos. It was too lowbrow for philosophy departments, and it was too highbrow for literature departments. It was sort of this really super niche area. And so I guess, I first started university, and I first started my PhD when cultural studies was sort of in, I guess, its second golden age. It was in the midst of that sort of cyberculture. Cultural studies was it was very sexy. It was very glamorous. There was a lot of glamorous theorists involved in cultural studies, and I sort of started amongst that time. And it was very seductive, and I quit my PhD because I had I had a lot of stuff going on, and I quit it, and I came back to it 10 years later, and the whole landscape had changed. Cultural studies was a joke in that sense. I mean, if you've read Don DeLillo's White Noise, it's a whole book that spends virtually its entire length lampooning the sorry state of cultural studies, really. And that's where we'd sort of landed. It was like awakening in a parallel universe to find that everything had changed, and suddenly the stuff I was into was not taken so seriously anymore. And, academia had become this sort of heavily monetized, heavily undead version of itself. People have talked about the zombie academy, where the sort of anything for the sake of pure research is put aside for the need to make research dollars. So the need to bring research dollars in, and what that does to a pure research culture, for example. And I came back to that sort of environment, and I sort of lamented that that lost age of really exciting cultural studies. And I guess going through that struggle of trying to fit into this new environment, I was trying to say something about that, and I was trying to say something about how it had all become so stale, and how it all become a straitjacket for just this pure sort of money-making exercise, I guess, and how I felt on the outside, and I felt like a complete outsider to all of that. But I still had this research interest that wouldn't go away, and I still wanted to write about Ballard, and I still wanted to say something about Ballard, even if I don't really come to any conclusions. So all of that was going on. So yeah, it's kind of a lamentation of that sort of era, but at the same time trying to work through what comes next. And I don't think there is really any answer in the book about what comes next. In sense of a warning, I mean, I guess it's also about the struggles of doing a PhD. I think that anyone who's done a PhD, no matter on what topic, it can become a very isolating experience, especially if you're a single person like I was who'd just gone through a bad breakup and you're sort of on your own, living on your own. You don't really go out to campus to meet people. You're spending all this time inside of your head. There's no real support networks. I guess you can get. It's different these days, I guess, with various online communities. But certainly when I was going back to finish my PhD, there wasn't really a lot of support. And it's kind of why I set up the website Ballardian.com as well, was to try and find a community of like-minded people. So I guess it's about all of that. I mean, I guess if there's a warning signal to anyone, it might be to people starting a PhD. I don't know.
Okay. That's just one final little thing before we perhaps finish, unless there's anything you want to add. But it's interesting that you mentioned about where you're at now, because now it's clear that this constant need to almost like expel that interest and that rabbit hole of Ballardianism, like to get that down, to get that out, to get that done, whether or not it's in the form of your PhD or in this Applied Ballardianism, the book is now your kind of extended PhD. So you're talking about now and after the book. Was there a big moment of catharsis, or has writing the book actually just moved the stone as opposed to like overturning it?
I thought there would be a sense of catharsis, but I honestly believe the book has thrown up even more questions. Look, I'll be honest with you. I've just given you a few motivations for why I thought I wrote the book, but I don't really know why I wrote it, and I don't really know how it came out in this form. It wasn't a conscious decision, for example. I mean, people talk about this book about being theory fiction, right? But when I was writing it, I didn't make this conscious decision to say, I'm going to write this piece of theory fiction. I didn't even know that was a so-called genre or a movement or whatever. It just seemed the only way that I could make sense of all of that stuff that I was going through. And so the theory part of my book is like, there's sentences, sometimes whole paragraphs that are lifted from early drafts of my PhD. And they sort of exist in the book as articulations of the theoretical mess that the narrator is finding himself in. But they're sort of trace elements of this old life. So it's kind of like that reality bleeding through. And so, as I said, it was originally commissioned by Mark Fisher for Zero Books. And I remember spending 3 years on the first chapter. And I just couldn't get past that first chapter. And I just didn't know how the hell I was going to write this. And then I lost the Zero contract because I'd taken so long and I hadn't produced anything. And then I just the next couple of years are really a blur. I would sit down at the computer most nights, almost like on autopilot, and start to just, it was almost like automatic writing whatever came out, and it sort of came out in this form. That was I remember that was cathartic. At the moment I hit upon this sort of hybrid form of the way I wanted to write it. But then it was really jarring. The theory was jarring with the fiction, and I kept thinking, I've got to write this as a novel. I've got to write this as a novel, but the theory bits kept intruding. So I kind of hadn't cleansed my system of that aspect of myself, and I just kept at it. It was a very torturous process because it's technically very difficult to pull something like that off. I mean, writing a straight novel would have been way easier. So it was cathartic in the sense that I felt like I'd expunged that theoretical aspect of myself, and I don't see myself as a theorist. I don't see myself as a philosopher. Since my book has been released, people have had all these theoretical discussions about it, but I feel I can't really contribute to that. I've just put this book out there in the world as an object, and people are interpreting it in all these different ways, and that's fantastic. But to ask me about what the book is about and whether I feel it's purged something in myself, I kind of think it has, but I don't really know. I don't think I've fully rid myself of it. I have in mind a sequel to the book, and it would take place in a sort of even more of a disembodied world than the one in this book. Ballard would be even more of a peripheral figure in that one. So I guess I've still got the ideas percolating around, and I've met a lot of people who've been, I mean, some people have hated the book. I'll fully admit that. It's not a book. It's going to be a polarising book. It's not going to appeal to everyone, and that's fine. But a lot of people have been said to me they've been quite inspired by it, or it's mirrored aspects of their own experience in this really uncanny way, or they've been completely bamboozled by it but still fascinated by it. And to me, that's a really satisfying reaction. And that's kind of cathartic in a sense as well, because that's really the overriding sense that I get from Ballard's book, is this sense of mystery and what is this object? What does it mean? It's affecting me on this deep level, but I don't really know what it is. I think at this point, you should talk about your review of the book, because I thought your review of the book was really great. And you were talking about that sort of bamboozlement at picking up my book as this objects. I thought that was fantastic, because it's kind of the impression I want. I don't want it to inspire any sort of easy answers or any easy connections. If people hate it, that's fine. If people like it, it's great. But it was bamboozling to me, and if it's bamboozling to other people, that's completely fine.
Yeah, I guess in short, my review can kind of be condensed to just someone kind of finishing it up and saying, well, what the hell am I supposed to do with this? But in a nice way, you know. Kind of you've now gained all this strange, almost second-hand knowledge. So it's like you're learning Ballardianism from somebody else who's clearly interpreting Ballard in quite a dangerous way. So you kind of begin application of the book yourself to your own life, which perhaps you're also doing in a dangerous way. And then once you realise that, you're kind of not entirely sure where to go. But I think that's a nicer, not nicer, that's a silly word, a better conclusion than, or if you can call that a conclusion, but that's a better way to, I think, finish up a book than just if there was a neat conclusion at the end of the book, I'd be somewhat disappointed and probably even think that person hasn't really understood Ballard too well, because the only conclusions Ballard really ever gave within his own works were when they were within kind of small, walled-off societies, which almost always went wrong because they were aiming for a conclusion. So perhaps if you were to wall it off, it's just going to kind of implode if you were to do that anyway.
Yeah, I don't think any theory can encapsulate Ballard, as I've sort of outlined, and I think you're right. Any attempts to sort of wall it off and limit its mysterious power is kind of defeating the purpose. I think Ballard continues to inspire me in a way that I never thought possible when I first started reading him. I can't believe I'm still writing about him. What is it now? It's almost 25 years later since I first wrote my first article on Ballard. Yeah, it's kind of an obsession. To go back to your point about catharsis, I think there is a catharsis because I feel free now. I kind of feel like I can write about other things. You know, I don't know. I could write a book about gardening or a cookery book or something. I really don't know. All I know is that I've purged Ballard for now, and that's kind of liberating in the sense that I think my education at the feet of Ballard is done. I think it's finally complete. It's kind of like, subscribing to a guru for a number of years, and then you finally realise, hey, I'm done here. So that's kind of like how it is.
Okay, I think that's a good place to finish up. Unless there's something else that I've missed or something you'd like to add.
No, look, I think that covers it. I don't know how this is going to fit in your other podcast series, which I've enjoyed very much, by the way. But I hope it's of been some interest to you.